88.7 FM, the cutting edge of the Hudson Valley.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Historic Huguenot Street's weekly program on WFNP The Edge, where we discuss local history, historic preservation, and education. I'm Kaitlin Gallucci, and I'm the communications manager at Historic Huguenot Street. Tonight, we'll be discussing the organization's impressive permanent collection. I'm sure by now you know that Historic Huguenot Street is a nonprofit National Historic Landmark District dedicated to preserving historic buildings and artifacts of the Huguenot Street families who founded New Paltz. What you may not know is that our historic collections are very extensive. Of course, if you drive or walk or bike down Huguenot Street, you see the stone houses. That's what we're known for. There are 7 historic houses on the 10-acre site, as well as the reconstructed French church, which was built in the 1970s, in the style of the original church. Other than that church, all of the houses are original, and the burial ground around the church is original as well. However, you probably also notice a number of smaller structures scattered throughout the site, like barns and sheds. These buildings are also historic structures, so the grand total of historic buildings on the site, counting all of these outbuildings, is over 30. A bit of background on the organization, since it's relevant to what we're discussing. You've probably noticed that one of the houses on Huguenot Street is a large Queen Anne Revival mansion. Of course, this sticks out a bit. You can't miss it. It may even seem a little out of place. But that mansion is one of the reasons Historic Huguenot Street exists today. It originally started out as a modest stone home similar to the others on the street in the early 1700s, built by Pierre Deo, hence the name the Deo House. Much later, in the 1890s, Abraham Deo Broadhead and his wife Gertrude Deo, who were very wealthy, used their newly acquired wealth to transform their family's ancestral home into the Colonial Revival and Queen Anne Revival mansion you see today. The Queen Anne style originated in Britain and came into vogue in America in the 1880s during the Victorian era. It was reminiscent of the English Baroque architectural style during the reign of Queen Anne in the early 18th century. The Colonial Revival style was a nationalistic design movement partly motivated by the rapidly increasing industrial way of life at the time. It was a result of a renewed historic consciousness. Americans were inspired to recognize and embrace their colonial past. This is really well represented in the Deo House. As you'll notice, part of the first floor exterior is still made of stone. This is from the original stone house. In fact, you'll see when you tour the inside of the house that the original wooden ceiling beams are also intact. So, as a result of Colonial Revival sensibilities, the family incorporated these parts of their ancestral home into the modern design of the home they were building. However, this was not without drama. Newspapers at the time were highly critical of the changes to the Deo House and what they considered to be the destruction of a colonial relic. Residents were urged to organize to prevent the other stone houses from meeting the same fate, and that led to the creation of the Huguenot Patriotic, Memorial, and Historical Society, which today is Historic Huguenot Street. In addition to the structures and houses themselves, all of the homes that are open for tours, which is most of them, are furnished in a style relevant to the period of time we are interpreting in the house. And most of the furnishings in the houses are, though not necessarily original to the house, it's important to remember that these houses were occupied by residents for generations. The furnishings are historic pieces as well. If you've ever taken a tour at Historic Huguenot Street, which you can do anytime by making an appointment or during our regular hours beginning May 7th, you'll have an idea of just how many objects are furnishing these houses. They're curated to appear as they would have when the family was living there. And we're so lucky to have such an impressive and extensive collection of historic objects with which to do this. These items have been acquired over the years through donations and paid acquisitions. Part of Historic Huguenot Street's mission is to preserve and protect these historically significant collections pieces. Another part, though, is to share them, to educate the public. If you visit huguenotstreet.org/collections, that's huguenotstreet.org/collections, plural, you can see some of the digital exhibits of collections pieces that we have publicly available thanks to a partnership with Hudson River Valley Heritage. If you don't know, Hudson River Valley Heritage is a digital library that provides visitors with free access to search and browse historical materials from the collections of libraries, archives, museums, and historical societies located in Columbia, Greene, Dutchess, Ulster, Sullivan, Rockland, Orange, Putnam, and Westchester counties. This is a great resource for those doing historical research on New York State. The digital collections contain photographs, maps, letters, postcards, manuscripts, scrapbooks, memorabilia and ephemera, and much more. Keep in mind that what you find on this site typically represents only a small percentage of the materials held by the organizations. You can access this website at hrvh.org. But again, if you go to huguenotstreet.org/collections or search for Historic Huguenot Street on hrvh.org, you can see some of our historical collections pieces and archival materials, including pieces related to African American history, Native Americans in the Hudson Valley, the Civil War, historic clothing and textiles, colonial manuscripts, and more. Right now, I'd like to introduce my two guests for the evening. Tonight, I'm speaking to Kaitlin Cummings, the Collections Care Assistant at Historic Huguenot Street. Kaitlin actually started as a collections intern while she was a SUNY New Paltz art history student before becoming a part of the organization's staff when she graduated. Hi, Kaitlin.
Hi, Caitlin. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My other guest is Sam Ruck, a senior English major at SUNY New Paltz and my intern. You may remember Sam from last week. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Caitlin.
Thank you for joining us again.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Now, interestingly enough, Kaitlin and Sam took a class together at SUNY New Paltz, Professor Mulready's class called The Materials of History, Thought, and Art. Sam, can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it was an honors seminar on material culture and history. I wasn't part of the honors program, but Professor Mulready was kind enough to invite me to it.
That's good.
And yeah, no, it was very nice. But in general, when you're in kind of grade school, you're taught that artifacts are objects that are surrounded by history, but are stuff from hundreds or thousands of years ago. But what Professor Mulready kind of told us or put into our heads was that objects and artifacts aren't necessarily ancient. They are living, in a sense. They have a history that goes from the personal to, I don't really know how to describe it. But so essentially one of the goals of the class was to teach us that, people have a history and culture of their own, but so do objects, and objects can have just as much importance, if not more, than people themselves. So probably the most salient example that I can think of from that class was he gave us this one memoir called The Hare with the Amber Eyes. It's by let me get this right. He is a sculptor, I think.
Yes, he is a ceramicist.
Right, thank you, Caitlin.
Absolutely.
His name is Edmund de Waal, and he was a descendant of the Ephrusses, who were a family of, I think, Russian Jews who lived in Austria, specifically Vienna. And what was so kind of touching about this memoir was the fact that there was this kind of inheritance that Mr. de Waal kind of received as an adult. They were these little things called netsuke, which are miniature carved sculptures, that originated in Japan, that the family had kind of collected over something like 100 years, something ridiculous.
Wow.
But what was so amazing was that this family, when the Nazis came in, they were taking all their wealth, destroying it, but a maid of theirs, not even one of the members of the family, thought, these are important, we got to keep these. So she hid them in a mattress, and then eventually they were rediscovered. And he basically, what he did throughout this memoir was he retraced the history of these netsuke and what they meant to him and what they meant to his family. So it was really cool to eventually figure out our own kind of personal attachments to objects that we had and their own histories and things like that. So, yeah.
Nice. So I believe as part of this class, you guys took a tour at Historic Huguenot Street, correct?
Yes, we did.
Was that your first time at Historic Huguenot Street?
For me personally, yes, it was.
Was it for you, Kaitlin, as well?
I, like many other SUNY New Paltz students, had traveled to Huguenot Street on my own. You know, I had done like independent walkthroughs kind of with like groups of friends and stuff.
Right.
But I had always, peeked in the windows, but never really been in the houses. So to go with the class and to do, a material study of the objects, the collections pieces you were mentioning inside the houses, yeah, that was my first experience with that. And it was just amazing. It was so cool.
Yeah.
So cool.
Great. So, Kaitlin, as an art history major and someone who's now working in collections care, can you tell us why you think a class like this, studying material culture, is so important? I mean, and especially,
Absolutely.
this is a good example since you were an art history major and,
Yeah.
Sam is an English major. So, I mean, for people of all majors and all interests, why would this be important for them?
Yeah, Professor Mulready's class was really my first experience studying material culture, and I had never been exposed to that kind of study before, but it was really just kind of a classic educational experience for me in that, like Sam was talking about, looking at the objects that I interacted with on a daily basis really gave me a new appreciation for the things and the places that I interact with all the time. I never really stopped to think about, my hairbrush or my cell phone or, my bedside table as things that are really important to me.
Right.
But, his class just made me look at those objects and say, what would I do without these things in my life? So, his class really encourages students to stop and look at what we're doing on a daily basis, the objects that we use, and how they really shape us as people. So the class was just amazing. And what I took away from it is that no matter who you are and what object you're using, those objects always become imbued with you as a person and how you're using it, and how you're using one object could be completely different than how another person uses the same exact thing. So, material culture really serves to tell a record of history that is forgotten by textbooks, by, lectures. If you study material culture, it teaches you a different perspective of history. So I absolutely think it's important for everybody to just think about, material culture
No,
like
that's
that.
such a good point. Because, I mean, if you think about it, like, the objects that are in, like, the houses at
Right.
Historic Huguenot Street are kind of the equivalent of, what is today, like, your hairbrush and your cell phone.
Exactly,
It's what
yes.
that was for them back then.
Absolutely. And that's the way I look at it now. I mean, as collections care assistant, I really appreciate, that foundation that Mulready's class laid for me, because when I moved from intern working with the collections and then to collections care assistant managing the collections, it became that much more important to me to do justice by the collections pieces, to make sure that, all of those little oddities that people would have used in Victorian or colonial times were still kept, their integrity as objects were retained. That became really important to me as collections care assistant. So, yeah, it really was helpful.
Great. Sam, would you feel the same way? Do you have anything you'd like to add about the class?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just really interesting considering the fact that you, like Kaitlin said, you don't consider the history of most objects that you actually have. You don't consider how they're important to you, but you also don't consider that they have stories to tell, maybe not always interesting ones, but, take any piece of furniture you have. If you've inherited it from somebody that you know, or even if it's part of the family, or the family china or something, it has a story that you don't necessarily think about every day. You might use it sometimes, it might be special, it might have certain values you associate with it, but it came from somewhere. It has something to say, even if you don't stop and think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that always kind of amazes me with, like, collections pieces, which is just that, because, again, if you think about it like this and you realize that, like, the little things that we use now would be historic objects 100 years from now.
I love thinking about that.
To think that, like, somebody at some point, because we don't think about our objects now like, better save this, it's going to tell a story someday. But someone at some point along the way with all these collections pieces had the insight to say, I should make sure this doesn't get lost.
Absolutely.
Because someday this is going to be really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really amazing, and we're really lucky to have all of that. So Kaitlin, can you tell me a little bit more about what you did as the collections intern, and particularly what you do now as the collections care assistant?
Sure. I love talking about the internships at Huguenot Street, especially in the collections department.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I have a huge, fondness for the collections department, especially after the class that I took with Mulready. But the reason that I think the internship through the collections department is so vital is because it offers you such a broad range of skills, because, like you were talking about earlier, our collection is, thousands of pieces large and is so diverse in its content. So as a collections intern, I learned how to inventory everything from, colonial textiles, furniture, and kitchenware to Revolutionary War weapons, Victorian hair accessories, and even foreign children's toys. So,
Wow.
in that process of learning how to inventory, you really do touch such a wide variety of objects and get to learn so much about the proper handling of those different objects. So that's, an invaluable experience in and of its own right. But in addition to learning how to physically handle those historic artifacts appropriately, collections interns also have the opportunity to develop their writing skills. We all publish an Object of the Week blog, which you can actually find on Historic Huguenot Street, our website.
Yep.
And they also, all of the collections interns work on an end of the semester exhibit. So in preparing object
that's right.
labels and narratives, you just really get to develop your writing skills, which just sets you up for so many great opportunities in the future. So as collections care assistant, my job is actually very similar to what I did as an intern. I tour the historic houses on a daily basis to ensure that the houses are in good condition. I monitor weather and climate changes within the homes. And, my primary job is to take care of all of those collections pieces that we've been talking about. So whether that means dusting it or, cleaning it off or even making repairs, like those are the things that I do. And it's like we talked about, I do it because, I love to preserve things exactly as they are. And I want to honor all of those people that did, like you were talking about, think to set aside those objects for some time in the future. So, it's people like us in the collections department that are responsible for making sure that those pieces stay pristine, perfect, and, we're able to use them again in furnishing the houses.
Great. Well, I'm so glad you brought up the Object of the Week blog, because that's something I do want to talk about a little bit tonight. For those who haven't visited yet, it's available at hhscollections.wordpress.com, and every post is written by a collections intern in the curatorial department. Kaitlin, you have a few posts on there from your time as an intern.
I do, yes.
And I thought we could talk about one of these tonight, specifically David Bevier's, or if you choose to say Bevier, orderly book. This is actually part of our archives, but it definitely deserved to be featured.
Absolutely.
I was really excited to learn about this when it was posted, and I think it's a great example of how special the collections and archives at Historic Huguenot Street are. But first, can you tell us a little bit just about what an orderly book is?
Absolutely. So when I was an intern, I did a Revolutionary War exhibit, and we turned a lot to the archives in our collection to learn more about how the Revolutionary War affected Ulster County residents. So an orderly book is essentially a daily log of any Revolutionary War activity. So essentially, commands were made by General George Washington for the Continental Army. They were distributed at a headquarters, and essentially a representative from each Continental regiment would record General Washington's orders in an orderly book and then carry that orderly book back to their regiment in order to carry out the duties. So orderly books are a great way to learn essentially about what a soldier did on a day-to-day basis during the Revolutionary War.
Wow. Yeah. So in your post, you estimated that there are approximately 800 orderly books being created per day during the Revolutionary War, which would mean that the Continental Army created about 20,000 orderly books over the course of the war. However, there are only 1,000 accounted for, and Historic Huguenot Street has one, which is so amazing.
Oh, and it's in such good condition. You know
yes,
what I mean?
it was beautiful.
Yeah, right.
Why do you think so many have been lost?
This was a huge question that we had when we were doing this exhibit exhibit. And what our research proved was that, these 20,000 orderly books that were produced during the Revolutionary War were essentially lost, a large majority of them, due to the violence and destruction that occurred during the Civil War. So, these were being produced in, the latter half of the 1700s, but, fast forward 100 years later in American history, and the Civil War really decimated a lot of that written record. So, especially in the South, there was a huge amount of orderly books lost simply because, the Civil War affected a lot more devastation in the South. But there are still about 1,000 orderly books left today, and you are absolutely correct. We are so lucky to have one in our collection at Historic Huguenot Street.
Great. So if you're on the Object of the Week blog, you could just search for the words orderly book or Kaitlin Cummings, and you can see the post about this piece and some great pictures of it. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Kaitlin and Sam.
This is Salif Diarra, a local health worker in a remote village in Mali, West Africa. This is Mori, a child who survived malaria because of Salif's efforts. This is Bintu, a grateful mother, one of many in Salif's village. This is you, becoming part of the story. Help local health workers like Salif make the good go even further. Visit goodgoes.org to see the many ways you can help. Brought to you by Save the Children and the Ad Council.
Hello, car of teenagers. If you don't mind, I'm only going to broadcast this out of the speaker on the passenger side so we can talk in private. Okay, now that we're alone, what's with your friend's driving? Is he always this reckless? You should say something witty. Make a joke about the airbag or something. Hearses are funny, too. You could make a joke about hearses. Driver, just so you know, we're totally not talking about you. He suspects nothing.
Brought to you by the Ad Council and SpeakUpOrElse.com.
Hi, welcome back. You're listening to WFNP The Edge. I'm Kaitlin Gallucci, and I'm speaking to Collections Care Assistant Kaitlin Cummings and Historic Huguenot Street intern Sam Ruck. Now, Kaitlin, the curatorial department is very busy getting ready for opening day on May 7th, correct?
Yes, we are so busy, but it's worth it. It's going to be so exciting to open with our new tours. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about the process for selecting the collections objects that are used to furnish the historic houses?
Well, absolutely. The process is very similar to what you described earlier. The main focus is determining how we're going to interpret each space. So that really comes down to the decision of date. You have to nail down what are the time the end marks for the time period that you're going to be working within, and then whether it be 1790 to 1830 or 1830 to 1850, you take that time frame and then you basically do research on what the appropriate furniture would have been for people during those times. What would they have used in their houses? What pieces of furniture were most special to them? And then once you do that basic research to get a sense of what people of the time would have been using, you then take that and you go into your our collection at Historic Huguenot Street, and we pull out the very best pieces we have from those different period styles as representations of that era in American history.
Great.
Yeah. So it takes a lot of research, but
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm
definitely.
sure.
It's the funnest part is choosing the objects and then getting them into the house and staging it, because that really makes it real.
Right. I mean, I've noticed just over the past couple of years. I mean, if I check out, I'm not in the houses all the time like you are, but if I take a tour once and then maybe take a tour again several months later to see sometimes a room that looks completely different is really amazing.
Right. It's fun to refresh it every once in a while.
Yeah,
especially.
definitely.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about, without spoiling anything, but can you tell us about some of the objects that you think are particularly notable that might be coming out of storage this year?
Yeah. To kind of preface this, I want to just introduce that the Deo House, which you mentioned earlier, the Colonial Revival Deo House, is one of the primary focuses of our new refurnishing plan. And within the Deo House, we're kind of choosing to portray the chronological transition of American furniture. And so we're doing that basically through a tour through a couple of rooms. So as you walk from room to room, we're kind of taking you on a journey through American history via the pieces of furniture.
Right. So, I know. I caught. I just want to add in that I noticed. I went on the tour the other day. just the preview, and I noticed it really makes so much sense because technically, I mean, like we said at the beginning, that this house really does stick out. It's from a totally kind of different era than any of the other stone houses. So when you're in a tour at the Jean Hasbrook house and then you cross the street and suddenly you're 100 years in the future. And so with this new furnishing plan, it kind of, instead of just jumping 100 years, instead it gives you a little, a brief look at here are the steps we took to get here. Here's what things looked like during that 100 years until we came to that time.
Absolutely. And so what the Deo House is going to feature is 3 different rooms that channel 3 different period styles. One of them is Victorian, one of them is Empire style, and then the third is Federal style. I'm going to talk about the Federal room because that's, personally my favorite just aesthetically.
Yeah, sure.
But so the Federal period in American history is kind of categorized as 1790 to 1830, and it's remembered as like the coming into its own phase of American history where the colonies were, fresh from their break from British rule, and they were really deciding who they were going to be, as a country. So furniture began to reflect that. Craftsmanship became incredibly important. American-made products became incredibly important. So the Federal Room in the Deo House features some beautifully handcrafted American pieces that were made actually locally in Kingston, across the river in Poughkeepsie. And so one of those pieces is a Pembroke drop-leaf table with marble inlay. And it's very Federal in style. It's delicate lines. It's just really ornate fixtures, drawer handles, design. It's just all very delicate, very ornate. And I think that's why I just love the Federal style. Is it's something so particular to what was going on in American history at that time. So yeah, one of those pieces is the Pembroke drop-leaf table in the Federal Room, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and it's one of my favorites. So
yeah,
I
didn't know what object you were going to tell us about, but that was perfect because that is the most recent object on the Object of the Week blog.
Oh my gosh.
Do you even know that?
I didn't know that.
I believe that you didn't.
I didn't. It's funny that you say that because I'm sure Ashley, my coworker, the Ashley Trainer is the registrar at Historic Huguenot Street, and she and I have just, we've been working so hard, but we really appreciate our interns because they have been doing all of this promoting for us, which is so helpful in getting people excited about May 7th, our opening day.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I'm so glad to hear that was one of the objects of the week.
It's literally the most recent one.
Oh,
yeah.
how wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. I've spoken to Ashley Trainer, and she is making a point that, for this the rest of, now it's just a couple weeks left until opening day,
it's coming.
that the blog would feature some of those new objects that, have never really been seen, or at least not for many years, in the houses before.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. A lot of them have never been displayed in any of the historic houses. We've had them in our collection for decades, but they really haven't had an opportunity to shine or, be placed into a fitting situation, a fitting room. So we're very excited.
I mean, we can't show everything.
Well, and
we have too much.
We have over 10,000 objects in our collection.
Wow, so I didn't even realize the real number.
Oh,
that's amazing.
It's a lot. And so, yeah, I'm not going to sit here and claim I touch every single one of those 10,000 objects every day, but we definitely have a lot to choose from, so we're excited to bring out some fresh pieces. Yeah.
Awesome. So I know the curatorial department also usually has some exhibits in the Dubois Fort Visitor Center. Do you know the next exhibit that's coming up?
Yeah, so like I was talking about, the interns work so hard over the course of a semester to prepare an exhibit. They do extensive research based on a topic that we provide to them, and then, they work on labels and a narrative, and so, a lot of the credit I want to give to the collections interns because they've done a great job. And our upcoming exhibit is in the works, but it will be installed in the Dubois Fort prior to May 7th. So you'll be able to visit it on opening day if you choose.
Cool.
And that exhibit is going to be on portrait miniatures, which, we're a 19th century oddity. And so the exhibit will essentially talk about the early progression of photography as a medium and also some of the individuals that are featured in those portrait miniatures.
Great.
Yeah, we're very excited about it. It's a cool show.
Yeah, well, I mean, you gotta love oddities.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of oddities and the word
too.
oddity. So,
yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you, Kaitlin.
Thank you.
Now, before we wrap up, I'd just like to make a bit of a public service announcement, and I think the curatorial department will appreciate this. This will probably sound like common sense, especially if you've been listening to this show, But I think a lot of people assume that the furnishings in the houses are replicas. A few things are, but only very few. But the majority of them are real. So I do want to say this, which is when you take a tour at Historic Huguenot Street, please do not touch any of the furnishings.
Please do not touch them.
We've seen this a lot where people will maybe pick something up from a table or lean on the back of a chair. But visiting a house museum is like visiting any other museum. You can't reach out and touch things. I know when you go to a house museum, you're surrounded by objects, and the room typically looks lived in, and it's meant to. So we understand, but it's important to remember that, like with any museum objects, these objects can only be handled by professionals with gloves, professionals like Kaitlin. So we're wrapping up now, but listeners can tune in next Thursday at 7:30 p.m. for our final show of the semester at WFNP.org or 88.7 FM. And next week I'll be speaking to Director of Public Programming Kara Gafkin about Huguenot Street's brand new tours launching on May 7th. Thanks for listening.
WFNP.